Chet Rollins' right hand was already wrapped around the front of Bruce Lee's white jacket when Johnny Carson's pen hit the desk. Not on purpose. It just fell. The way a pen falls when the hand holding it forgets what it's doing because the eyes have found something they cannot leave. Chet stood 6'4", 347 pounds, a former offensive lineman from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. 11 years keeping unwanted things away from John Wayne. His shoes were polished, his black jacket pressed. He was the kind of man who filled a doorframe the way a door fills a doorframe, completely and without apology. Bruce Lee weighed 135 pounds. His feet were 4 inches off the floor. The 480 people in Studio One at NBC Burbank had stopped breathing somewhere between the moment John Wayne said one single word and the moment Chet's hand closed around that white lapel. They were not applauding. They were not murmuring. They were simply still. Ed McMahon's coffee cup was halfway to his mouth. It had been there for 4 seconds. Camera 3 had the 2-shot. Camera 5 had the wide. Fred DeCordova, in the production booth, where he had sat since 1970, was watching both monitors and had not reached for the commercial button. And Bruce Lee was smiling, not performing it, not offering it to the audience. Smiling the way a man smiles when something he already knew was going to happen has arrived exactly on schedule. Nobody in that building understood the smile yet. 31 years later, not one person who had been in that audience would forget what happened next. They had 11 seconds. Subscribe and stay with me, because what Bruce Lee did in those 11 seconds is the reason John Wayne never said this night's name in public for the rest of his life. That smile had been 11 hours in the making. It started at 7 that morning on Roscommare Road in Bel Air. In a converted garage, Bruce Lee had turned into something between a training space and a thinking room. He was at the wooden dummy when the phone rang. Linda Tuckett, his manager, was on the line. Bruce didn't stop moving. He finished the combination he was running. 16 moves, the same 16 he had refined since he was 14 years old in Hong Kong. Then walked inside. His manager said Wayne's people had contacted the Tonight Show's production office with one request: no martial arts demonstrations during Bruce's segment. John Wayne didn't want to share the floor with that kind of thing. Bruce asked him to repeat it. He did, word for word. Bruce hung up and walked back out to the wooden dummy. He worked it for 40 more minutes without speaking. He didn't mention the call to Linda. He didn't bring it up when his assistant arrived at 9. He simply kept working while the November morning came up gray over the hills above Bel Air. What was moving through his mind during those 40 minutes, his daughter Shannon would say years later, was not anger. It was something quieter, something closer to certainty. Across the city that same morning, John Wayne was at the Beverly Hills Hotel reviewing the Tonight Show run of show with his publicist. Segment order confirmed. Wayne first, 18 minutes. Chet Rollins sat in the corner, saying nothing, the way he always sat in rooms where other people were talking, large, still, and entirely present. By 6:30 that evening, both men were at NBC Burbank. Wayne's team had been given the primary green room, larger, better lit, closer to the stage entrance. Bruce's team was placed in the secondary room down the hall by a segment producer named Jim Mahoney, who never asked why the arrangement had been made. Gary Shimizu was 24, 3 weeks into his job running cable on The Tonight Show. His father had spent 3 years behind the wire at Manzanar. Gary was working the corridor between the two green rooms when he saw Chet Rollins standing at the far end of the hall, still, quiet, watching the door to the secondary green room like a man with nowhere else to be. 20 minutes later, Bruce's assistant came back inside. She told him the large man hadn't moved. Bruce set his tea down. He said, "Good." Doc Severson's band played John Wayne out at 8:43, and Studio One rose for him the way it always rose for the men who had been American mythology long enough to outlast the arguments about it. Wayne settled into the guest chair with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to be the largest presence in any room he entered. He talked about McHugh. He talked about the Western, why it wasn't dead, what it meant to carry a genre for 35 years. "I've never played a character in my life, Johnny," he said. "I've always played myself." The audience gave him what they always gave him, warmth without question. Carson moved him gently toward the subject. There were new films coming out of Hong Kong, a young Chinese actor filling theaters in ways that had surprised the industry. Enter the Dragon had grossed over $25 million on a budget of $850,000. He wondered what Wayne made of it. Wayne smiled the smile of a man who had made 53 films before the person being discussed was born. "Johnny, I've been knocking men down on screen since 1930. 135 pounds kicking in slow motion doesn't change what audiences want. They want a man who looks like he means it." The audience laughed. Wayne settled back. He considered the subject closed. Carson didn't laugh. He picked up his pen and wrote something on his cue card. Quickly, one line, the way he wrote things he didn't want to lose. Donna Weissman, a script assistant standing 9 feet to Carson's left, read it clearly from where she was standing. She would keep what Carson wrote to herself for the next 31 years. In the secondary green room down the hall, Bruce was watching Wayne's segment on the monitor bolted above the coffee table. His manager sat beside him. Gary Shimizu was working cable in the corridor outside. Through the gap under the door, Gary could hear nothing from inside the room. No raised voice, no reaction, no comment. Only the kind of silence that gathers around a man who has already decided how something ends and is simply waiting for it to begin. When Wayne said 135 pounds kicking in slow motion, Bruce reached forward and set his teacup down on the table. He didn't rush it. He smoothed the lapel of his white jacket with one hand, the same jacket he had chosen that morning. Then he stood. His manager said, "You ready?" Bruce said, "I have been ready since this morning." He walked to the door and waited for the floor manager's knock. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what Bruce Lee did when he walked through that door is the reason this story took 30 years to fully surface. Doc Severson's band played Bruce out at 9:12. He walked onto the Carson stage in white, moving with the economy of a man who never wasted a step. And the reception from that audience was stronger than Wayne's team had expected. Bruce shook Carson's hand. He sat. He didn't acknowledge Wayne directly, and Wayne didn't acknowledge him, and the cold space between those two silences said more than either man had spoken. Carson opened with "Enter the Dragon." Bruce answered the way he always answered, each word chosen 3 beats before it arrived. "What I do isn't about fighting, Johnny. It's about expressing the human body at its most honest." Wayne shifted in his chair. 2 inches. Camera 3 caught it. "Son," Wayne said, "I've had stuntmen who could express themselves pretty honestly, too." The audience gave a murmur, not a laugh, a murmur. Every professional in that building felt the difference. Bruce turned to Wayne slowly. He looked at him the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. "Mr. Wayne," he said, "would you like me to show your audience what I mean?" Wayne said one word, "Chet." No raised voice, no moved hand, no shift in expression. The word landed in the room the way a key lands in a lock, with a sound that was almost nothing, and a consequence that was everything. Chet Rollins walked from the wings, not running, walking, 8 steps, each one coming up through the stage floor. Carson's pen hit the desk flat. Ed McMahon's chair scraped back. The 480 people in Studio One went still, the way a room goes still when it knows what's coming next, has moved past anything anyone planned for that evening. Chet stopped, 3 feet from Bruce. 6'4", looking down at 5'7". 347 pounds, looking at 135. His right hand took the front of Bruce Lee's white jacket and lifted 4 inches off the floor. That was when Bruce Lee smiled. Not for the audience, not for the cameras. He smiled because he had understood something at 7 that morning on Roscommare Road that nobody else in that building would understand for another 11 seconds. He had understood that Wayne would do this himself, that the act of trying to prevent the demonstration would make it inevitable. He had known the shape it would take before he ever stepped into the car to Burbank. This was exactly the shape. Bruce's right hand came up, 2 fingers finding the pressure point on the inside of Chet Rollins' right wrist. The precise cluster of nerves his Sifu had shown him in a room above a hardware store in Kowloon in 1954. Not a strike, a placement. The kind of touch that doesn't hurt a man so much as rearrange his understanding of where his own arm belongs. Chet's grip opened, not by choice, because his hand stopped being his. Bruce's feet found the floor, 2 inches of controlled wrist rotation, nothing more. 347 pounds of Tuscaloosa, Alabama went to one knee on the Carson stage carpet. Not thrown, not struck, guided down as quietly as a door being closed by someone who doesn't want to wake the house. Bruce released, stepped back 2 paces, hands at his sides. The stage was completely quiet. He turned and looked at John Wayne. The 3 seconds of silence that followed were the loudest thing Johnny Carson's stage had produced in 23 years of live television. What John Wayne said when those 3 seconds ended, in front of 480 people, in front of 29 million households, was the last thing anyone in that building expected him to say. John Wayne said, "Show me that again." Not anger, not challenge, not the voice he had used in 53 films when a man needed putting in his place. Something quieter than any of those. The tone of a man who has spent 35 years being the largest physical fact in every room he entered, and has just encountered something he genuinely does not understand, and for the first time in longer than he could say, actually wants to. The audience didn't make a sound. Bruce Lee looked at Wayne for 1 full second. Then he said, "Come here." John Wayne, 66 years old, Olo tie, the boots he had worn in more westerns than most men had seen in their lifetimes, stood up from Johnny Carson's guest chair and walked to the center of the stage. He didn't look at Carson, he didn't look at the audience. He walked to where Bruce was standing, and he stopped, and he waited. What followed ran 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Carson sat at his desk with his pen down and his hands flat and his eyes on the 2 men in front of him. Ed McMahon had pushed his chair back 6 inches. Chet Rollins stood in the wings with his jacket straightened, watching the man who had just put him on one knee. Bruce showed Wayne 3 things. The first was the pressure point. He demonstrated it on Wayne's own wrist gently with 2 fingers, just enough for Wayne to feel his hand soften without understanding why. Wayne looked at his own hand the way a man looks at something familiar that has just revealed a secret. The second was the 1-inch punch. Same demonstration Bruce had given at the Long Beach Karate Championships in 1964 for a room full of people who hadn't believed it was possible. Wayne rocked back on his heels and steadied himself and said nothing for 3 seconds. The third thing had no public name. His Sifu had called it the listening hand, the ability to read what an opponent intended to do for the single point where 2 bodies made contact, before the movement had started, before the decision had finished forming. Wayne held out his arm, and Bruce placed 2 fingers on his wrist and told him to try to move without telegraphing it. Wayne tried 3 times. Bruce read all 3 before they arrived. Wayne lowered his arm. He looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that didn't belong to any of his pictures. He put out his right hand. Bruce took it. Wayne's left hand came to Bruce's shoulder, the kind of grip that means something transferred between 2 men that neither would fully translate into words afterward. Gary Shimizu, running cable in the rigging above stage right, watched Wayne's hand settle on Bruce Lee's shoulder. He had grown up in Gardena. His father had spent 3 years behind the wire at Manzanar, without ever raising his voice about it. Gary was 24 years old, and he had never in his life seen a man who looked like Bruce Lee standing on a stage that mattered this much, with the biggest name in American cinema holding his shoulder like it meant something. He kept his NBC crew pass from that night in a drawer in his house in Torrance for the rest of his life. Subscribe if you haven't, because what happened after the cameras went dark, and what Carson finally admitted 9 years later, is the part of this story that never made it into any tribute reel. The tape didn't move through the martial arts community this time. It moved through a different set of channels entirely. Quieter ones, older ones, ones that had been carrying things across distances long before the industry noticed they existed. Community centers in Little Tokyo. A film student at UCLA named Peter Wang, watching it on a borrowed television in a professor's office in Naunitz Hall at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, not speaking when it ended. A martial arts instructor in Monterey Park, who showed the same copy to his Friday adult class 3 weeks in a row until the tape wore thin and the picture broke into static somewhere around the 4-minute mark. Nobody charged for a copy. Nobody would have. In the spring of 1974, a man from Bob Wall's dojo ran into Chet Rollins at a gas station on Sepulveda Boulevard in Van Nuys. Chet was filling his truck. The man mentioned Carson. Chet put his gas cap back on, looked across the roof of the truck for a moment and said, "The little guy didn't have to do it the way he did. He could have embarrassed me in front of the whole country. He chose not to. I've thought about that most days since November." He pulled out onto Sepulveda and drove north. Nobody heard from Chet Rollins publicly again. In 2003, a Los Angeles cultural magazine ran a retrospective on Bruce Lee's American legacy. A researcher contacted Donna Weissman, who had been a script assistant at The Tonight Show in 1972 and had stood 9 feet from Carson's left shoulder on the night in question. She had never spoken about what she saw Carson write on his cue cards. She spoke now. Carson had written twice that night. The first time, after Wayne's 135 pounds kicking in slow motion line, 2 words, "He's wrong." The second time, after the 4 minutes on stage, 1 word only, "Historic." 9 years after that night, Bob Blumenthal sat down with Johnny Carson for a Rolling Stone retrospective on The Tonight Show's Burbank decade. Near the end of the conversation, he asked Carson to name one moment he wished more people had seen. Carson was quiet for 7 seconds. The transcript shows the gap. Then he said, "There was a night in '72. John Wayne, a young man from Hong Kong. I was at the desk. I couldn't tell you today what film either of them was promoting, but I watched a 135-pound man show the biggest movie star in America something he didn't know. And Wayne was large enough, I mean that in every sense, to say so. People think I've seen everything at this desk. I haven't, but I saw that." Bruce Lee died on June 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. John Wayne died on June 11th, 1979. He was 72. The NBC crew pass Gary Shimizu kept in a drawer in Torrance was dated November 14th, 1972. The night Bruce came home, Linda asked how it went. He thought for a moment and said, "I showed Mr. Wayne that size is only information. He turned out to be a good student." Linda kept that line for the rest of her life. It is the truest thing Bruce Lee ever said about that evening. It may be the truest thing he ever said about himself. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one is already waiting.